Hey gang, and welcome back. Just a reminder, you can now use the promo code MTGMudsta, all caps, at flipsidegaming.com. You'll get 10% off orders over $10 and help with the channel at the same time. This Thursday we find ourselves back at Stomping Grounds, and I am playing my Zedruu deck and keep a hand with Azorius Signet, Enlightened Tutor, Cascade Bluffs, 2 Plains, Clever Impersonator, and a Hollowed Fountain. Kai is playing his Sek'Kuar deck and keeps a hand with Blood Crypt, Llanowar Wastes, Forest, Buried Alive, Razaketh, Sunbird's Invocation, and Viscera Seer. Pat is playing his Kemba deck and keeps a hand with Basilisk Collar, Steel Shaper's Gift, 3 Plains, Nykthos, and Secluded Step. It's a Secluded Step. And lastly, James is playing his Admiral Beckett Brass deck and keeps a hand with Mountain, Admiral's Orders, Conspiracy, Daring Saboteur, Blood Crypt, Fathom Fleet Captain, and Fanatical Firebrand. Kai wins the die roll and starts us off. Kai plays a Blood Crypt, taking 2 and casts a Viscera Seer. Pat plays a Plains and casts Steel Shaper's Gift. He goes and finds a Masterpiece Sword of Feast and Famine and puts it into his hand. James plays a Blood Crypt, also taking 2, and casts a Fanatical Firebrand. He moves to combat and swings the Firebrand at Pat for 1 and passes turn. In a stark contrast to everyone else's turn 1, I play a Plains and pass. Kai plays a Llanowar Wastes and casts a Faithless Looting. He discards Razaketh and a Forest. And moving to combat, Kai swings a Viscera Seer at James for 1. Pat plays a Plains and casts Sram before passing to James. James plays a Mountain and swings a Firebrand at Kai for 1. James then casts a Fathom Fleet Captain in his second main phase and passes turn. I play another Plains for my land for turn, and I cast an Azorius Signet and pass. Kai plays a Dragonskull Summit and casts Buried Alive. He grabs Brawn, Anger, and Scourge of Niltoth. Moving to combat, Kai swings a Seer at me for 1. Pat plays a Plains and casts a Basilisk Collar, drawing from his SRAM trigger. Pat then equips a Collar into SRAM and swings it at Kai, dealing 2 damage and gaining 2 life. James plays a Smoldering Marsh and moves to combat. He swings the Captain at Pat and the Firebrand at me and pays for the Captain's attack trigger, gaining a Pirate token. I play a Hollowed Fountain, taking 2 life, and I tap out to cast Jace. I activate a Zero ability, aka Brainstorm, and I pass to Kai. Kai plays a Carplusian Forest and casts a Jared's Orders, losing 1 for getting a Green from one of his playing lands. He grabs Wood Elves and a Woodful Primus, putting the Primus into his graveyard and the Elves into his hand. Pat plays a Nykthos and casts his commander, Kemba. Moving to combat, he swings Sram at Jace for 2 and gains 2 life. James plays a Graven Cairns as a land for turn. I begin to suspect that he's just playing Rakdos Pirates with Admiral Beckett Brass as a clever ruse. James then sacrifices his Firebrand to deal 1 to Kemba, and casts a Fathom Fleet Cutthroat, whose Enter the Battlefield trigger allows him to destroy Kemba. Moving to combat, James swings the token at Jace and the Captain at Pat. On my upkeep, I cast Enlightened Tutor and I go and find Rhystic Study. Aw geez. I then play Cascade Bluffs and cast the Study before passing to Kai. Kai pays 3 in his first main phase to cast Wood Elves and doesn't pay the 1, letting me draw. He grabs a Forest and puts it onto the field before passing turn. Pat plays a Plains and finally casts Sword of Feast and Famine. He doesn't pay the extra 1 and I draw a card. Pat then draws from SRAM trigger and equips the sword onto the Dwarf. Moving to combat, Pat swings SRAM at James for 4, gaining 4 life, dealing 4 damage, untapping his lands, and forces James to discard a card. James discards Conspiracy, and in his second main phase, Pat casts a Leonin Shakiri and lets me draw again. The joke is really on us though this time, and James plays an island for his turn, before moving to combat. James swings the Cutthroat and token at me, while the Captain goes at Pat. James pays 2 for the attack trigger and gains another Pirate token. In his second main phase, James casts a Siren Reaver and lets me draw a card. At the end of James's turn, I cast Tithe to go and find a Plateau and a Tundra and put them into my hand. I play Tundra as my land for turn, and I cast an Act of Authority, exiling Pat's Sword of Feast and Famine. I then bring out Talisman of Progress, and I pass to Kai. At the end of my turn, Pat cycles his Step. Kai casts Metamorphosis targeting his Wood Elves, and this is the second time I've seen this spell in the last 2 months. Kai then casts Sek'Kuar, and then takes 1 from his Llanowar Wastes to cast an enemy dead. He brings back, you guessed it, Razaketh, and then sacrifices the Viscera Seer to the demon to lose 2 life and tutor for a card. Kai also gains a Graveborn from the Seer dying, and then moves to combat. He swings his Razaketh at Pat and the Graveborn at James because they have haste thanks to Anger, and Pat takes 7 while James takes 3. Pat plays a Plains for his turn and casts Audric, Lunarch Marshal. Pat then moves to combat, which triggers Audric to give all of his creatures lifelink and death touch. Pat then swings the Leonin at Kai and deals 2 damage and gains 2 life. James untaps for his turn and casts Admiral Beckett Brass in his first main phase. He then moves to combat, and Audric gives all of Pat's creatures lifelink and death touch once more. James then swings 4 creatures at Pat, and Pat is put between a rock and a hard place, as James is pretty much guaranteed to get in with 3 creatures, which in turn will trigger Admiral Beckett Brass. Pat decides to block the Cutthroat with Audric and gain 3 life. He then takes 10 damage from the remaining pirates, and upon 3 of them damaging him, James gets to steal Pat's SRAM with Admiral Beckett Brass. On my upkeep, I have my active authority exile Kai's Animate Dead. With the targeting on the stack though, Kai sacrifices the Graveborn to Razaketh, taking 2 to go and tutor for a card. I then give Kai my active authority, and I play a command tower in my main phase as my land for turn. I cast Temple Bell, and I move to my end step, discarding Otherworldly Atlas, Teleria West, and Paradox Haze. For Kai's turn, he casts a Phyrexian Delver, presumably to try and cheat back out Razaketh, but I stop it with a mana drain. With nothing else, Kai passes turn. Pat plays a Buried Ruins for his land for turn, and casts Mass Calcify in his first main phase to clear away all but his own white creatures. He doesn't pay the extra one, and I get to draw a card. James still gets to keep SRAM though, sadly, and not wanting to attack into it, Pat passes turn. James casts a Talisman of Dominance in his main phase, and then brings out Lightning Greaves, getting to draw from the SRAM trigger. James then plays an island, and pays 2 mana to cast a Daring Saboteur, but doesn't pay the extra, and I get to draw. James then jams the boots onto the Saboteur, and swings both of his creatures at me. I have no choice but to take 4 points of damage, and he gains 2 life as Basilisk Collar is still equipped onto SRAM. James also gets a Saboteur trigger upon hitting me, and he draws a card and discards Hammer of Perforos. At the end of James's turn, I tap Temple Bell, and everyone draws a card. In my first main phase, I gain 5 colorless mana from my mana drain trigger, and I use 2 of it to cast Felwar Stone. I then cast Mirage Mirror, and I play a Serra Sanctum as my land for turn. I then cast Tezzeret the Seeker, and tap my Temple Bell to have everyone draw, before uptaking Tezzeret to untap the Signet and the Bell. I move to my end step, and I discard Dupscape, Solemnity, and Mind Over Matter. Kai plays a Forest for his turn, and casts Sunbird's Invocation before passing to Pat. Pat casts a Relic Seeker in his main phase, and follows up by casting a Johnny, Color of the Pride. He then upticks his Walker, putting a counter onto the newly cast Relic Seeker. Pat then activates Nykthos for 4 white mana, and he casts a Sword of Kaldra before passing to James. James plays an island for his turn, and casts Soul Ring, paying the 1 extra, and I realize I've missed a bunch of triggers. James then recasts Admiral Beckett Brass, and helps me out by paying the 1 extra again, and Kai applauds James's denying me card draw. James then moves the boots onto his Admiral, and moves to combat. He swings Admiral Beckett Brass, and the Daring Saboteur at Kai, and SRAM at Tezzeret. Kai takes 6, 3 of which is commander damage, and Tezzeret drops to 3 loyalty counters. James resolves his Saboteur trigger, drawing a card, and discards a Metallic Mimic. At the end of turn, I have everyone draw with Temple Bell. In my main phase, I cast a Sphere of Safety, and then activate my Mirage Mirror to become a copy of Kai's Sunbird Invocation, which I realize I should have done before casting the Sphere. Clever Impersonator then hits the stack, and I get a Sunbird's Invocation trigger, revealing the top 4 cards. I pick a copy enchantment, and cast it, having it come into play as a copy of the Invocation. The Impersonator also then comes in as a copy of the Invocation, and with my spells resolving, I uptick Tezzeret to untap my Signet and my Felwar Stone. On Kai's upkeep, he uses my active authority to exile my copy enchantment version of Sunbird's Invocation. He then casts a Carnival of Souls, revealing 2 cards, neither of which he can cast. Kai then brings out Deathrite Shaman, and reveals another card he can't cast. He takes 1 life and gains 1 black mana as the elf comes into play though. Kai then casts a Rakdos Signet, and reveals Ashnod's Altar and a land off the top for his Invocation trigger. Kai then taps his Deathrite Shaman, exiling a forest from his graveyard to cast Kadama's Reach. And I finally remember to start drawing from Study again. Kai reveals 3 off the top, and casts an Elvish Mystic, which comes into play dealing 1 to him and giving him 1 black mana. Kai then casts Elemental Bond, and reveals an Apprentice Necromancer, losing another life, and gaining a black mana as it comes into play. This also gives me another card. He then uses his floating black mana to activate the Necromancer, and brings out Razaketh, gaining 1 black mana, and losing another life, and then drawing a card from Elemental Bond. Kai then moves to combat, and swings Razaketh at James for 8. With nothing else, he passes to Pat. Pat plays a Plains, and pays 6 to cast True Conviction, not paying the extra and allowing me to draw. Pat then activates his Nykthos for 7 white mana, and puts the Sword of Kaldra onto his Relic Seeker. He then puts the Basilisk Collar onto the Seeker as well, and Pat upticks a Johnny to put another counter onto Leon and Shakiri, and moves to combat. At the beginning of his combat step though, I activate the Mirage Mirror to become a copy of Sphere of Safety, which is completely unnecessary, but it brings me happiness so I do it anyway. He decides to swing the Relic Seeker at James, and hits him for 16, gaining 16 life. Pat also gets the Renown trigger for his Relic Seeker, and goes to find Shield of Kaldra before passing to James. James casts a Dowsing Dagger in his main phase, and gives his 2 plants, which I attest is a mistake to Kai. Kai does lose 2 life, and gains 2 black mana, taking him inches closer to the grave with each new creature hitting the field. He uses that mana to cycle Sheltered Thicket, and James doesn't pay 1 extra, letting me draw a card. James then casts Forerunner of the Coalition, and Kai gains another black mana, and loses another life, and I draw from the study trigger. James reveals Dreamcaller Siren, and puts it on top of his library. James then puts the dagger onto his flyer, and moves to combat, and swings it at Pat. Pat decides to just take the hit, and the Dowsing Dagger flips to reveal Lost Veil. With nothing else, James passes to me. Now at this point, with all the creatures on the board and the life gain going on, I know I'm not going to be able to win through my traditional Form of the Dragon route. I decide to activate Temple Bell in my main phase, and we all draw a card. I play a Flooded Strand, and crack it taking 1 to go and find a Plains. I then try to resolve a Decree of Silence, but James counters it with an Admiral's Orders. I'm okay with this though, and I remember my Sunbird's Invocation trigger, and reveal the top 8 cards. I grab a Ghostly Prison, and cast it without paying the cost. I then uptick Tezzeret to untap 2 rocks, and I pay 4 mana to cast Replenish. Unfortunately for James, he can't counter this, and it gets to bring out so much goodness, and with Mind Over Matter on the board, not to mention protection with Dovescape and Decree of Silence, I'm able to force everyone to draw their libraries and not deck myself out thanks to the Ulamog I have in my list. Game review time. So this win was basically because no one else knew what my deck does, nor did they know that it was a combo deck. I can't fault James for countering the Decree of Silence because that enchantment is miserable to play against as an opponent. Kai's deck was super sweet, and Anger did a ton of action in his deck, allowing him to basically reanimate or cheat things out or tap for mana and get so much value out of his creatures entering the battlefield. I was really impressed with the deck, and even though he went super low, I think if we'd been able to untap, he would have probably stolen the game away. Pat's Kemba deck was certainly interesting, and it seemed like a typical kind of white Voltron deck. I do wonder if SRAM is not just the better commander, as he allows you to draw cards when Voltroning it up, but I do suppose that if it's because you like Kemba, that's a fair reason too. James's Admiral Beckett brass deck really surprised me. I didn't think there was enough substance to a lot of the pirates to really make a worthwhile deck, but James certainly did quite a bit of action in this game. And when she's on the board and you can connect with 3 pirates, stealing stuff is fantastic, especially since it's permanent and not just until end of turn. So all in all, I really enjoyed my trip to Stomping Grounds. They had a good group of Magic players, they had some D&D players, the store was light, bright, clean, it was cool. Please be sure to tune in every Monday and Thursday at 11 AM Eastern Standard Time for a guaranteed new video. You can also follow me on Twitter at MTGMudsta. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/MTGMudsta. And lastly, you can check me out when I stream at twitch.tv/MTGMudsta. This video is brought to you in support by my patrons. If you're looking for a way to help out the channel, please be sure to visit the link below. Thank you all for watching this video, and don't forget, friends are just opponents you haven't eliminated yet.